Hey everyone, this is Axel from Get Speaking English. Thank you so much for coming out today or for watching this lesson afterwards, because I'll be sharing it on YouTube as well. So, today we're going to be checking out part 3 and part 4 of the B2 first and C1 advanced exam, and we're going to be talking about people. So that's going to be great. We're going to be continuing our discussion all about people. So, I'm going to go through. We're going to look at some questions together. Feel free to comment in the chat. I love when people comment, so we can brainstorm some ideas together. So, as I mentioned, this lesson is aimed for students who are preparing either for the B2 first or the C1 advanced Cambridge exams. However, a lot of this vocabulary, a lot of these phrases will also be useful if, for example, you are studying for IELTS, for example, a general English exam, or also if you just want to reach in an upper intermediate or an advanced level in English. All right, perfect. So, really quick overview about what we are going to do today. So, we are going to check out some topics that might come up on the exam when talking about people. And today, actually, we are going to be talking about decisions. So, today we're going to be talking about decisions. And I just want to clarify, actually, really quickly, can you hear me okay? I should probably double check, but I think I'm okay. I was supposed to do this Wednesday, and then I had an audio problem, so I ended up not doing it on Wednesday. But feel free to type, let me know if you could hear me or not, and that would be super helpful. Anyways, we are going to be talking about decisions today. We are going to be looking at different parts of the exam together, as I mentioned. So part 3, style questions, we'll be looking at part 4 as well. And we're going to brainstorm some ideas together, maybe some model answers. And then afterwards, as usual, I always put the notes on Discord because we have a Discord server. And you could check out the Discord server as well if you would like to find other students preparing for these exams, and there are also some rooms in there that you can use to practice your speaking in. But as usual, I will share these notes on Discord, and also I will upload this video afterwards on YouTube as well, so you'll be able to refer to it, take notes, and all of that. All right, perfect. Okay, so as I mentioned today, under the topic of people, we are going to be talking about decisions. So, and as we all know, a decision is basically a choice that you make after maybe thinking a lot or taking into a lot of different considerations, thinking about different possibilities. So, let's make some collocations for decisions. So a collocation, as we know, basically 2-3 words that always get used together, right? So collocations, 2 or 3 words which always get used together. So an example of an English collocation might be, for example, we say to have breakfast, instead of to do breakfast or make breakfast like you might in some other languages. Or for example, we say to miss the bus instead of to lose the bus, for example. So decisions, for example, talking about difficult decisions, maybe we could talk about, a tough decision, for example. She was forced to make a tough decision about her future, maybe. So here, a tough decision, a very difficult decision. It was hard to come to a decision. And feel free to throw out any ideas in the chat as well, so we can add them to our ideas. Yeah, so obviously also difficult decision or a hard decision. It was a hard decision to make. So we might say that as well. Um, or maybe if a decision is good, right? So a good or correct decision, for example, we might say, you made the right decision. So that was basically the correct decision to make, right? Or if a decision makes sense, we could say that it was maybe a sensible decision. So I like to maybe do a lot of research and make sensible decisions. So so decisions that make sense, they're logical, right? Potentially also a rational decision. So a rational decision. So also ones that make sense, right? So for example, it's hard to make rational decisions when you are under a lot of stress, right? And I think a lot of us can sort of relate to that, right? So it's hard to make like logical, sensible decisions if you're under a lot of stress. All right, perfect. We could also go the other way, right? So we were talking about good or correct decisions. We could also talk about wrong decisions, right? Or maybe like a bad or a poor decision, right? So, for example, um, you know, it seems lately like I keep making one bad decision after another. So, we talk about a bad decision, and that's not the right decision. Not the right decision to make. Um, or, for example, maybe you had a really difficult decision to make, and then you made a decision, and then you ended up thinking, oh, maybe it's the wrong decision. So, for example, I think I might have made the wrong decision. So, yeah, exactly. So basically the opposite of the correct decision. We might also talk about, really important decisions, right? So for example, we might talk about big decisions, right? So, really, really significant decisions. So, for example, if you have an organization, for example, a lot of, big decisions, a lot of big decisions or major decisions are made by our board of directors, right? So a lot of people come together and they will think about the really huge decisions about something. You might also hear about key decisions. So key decisions. And these are really like significant decisions. Some decisions that make a huge impact, right? So for example, it was a oops, it was a key decision that changed the trajectory of our organization. So we talk about the trajectory here. This is also a really kind of fancy word, but the trajectory, basically the path that we took. So the path or the route that you take. Yeah, so, yeah, because it was a very important decision. We could also talk about decisions made on good information. So decisions made on really good decision or good information. So if you do a lot of research, we might talk about making an informed decision. So for example, I tend to do a lot of research to make sure I make informed decisions. So that might be a good one. So informed decisions are usually great. Or for example, an informed, oops, an informed decision is the best decision. So we do a lot of research, we, you know, get all the information, and we make a good decision based on that information. Um, and also, you might hear people making, for example, maybe a quick or a hasty decision. So, for example, if you make a hasty decision, you make it without doing a lot of research, without thinking a lot, because maybe you don't have a lot of time. So, for example, be careful. You don't want to make any hasty decisions. You should take your time instead. Do your research, right? Because a hasty decision, you make it quickly, maybe too quickly, because you don't have time to think or do research. Also, a quick decision would be one that, you have to do without in a short period of time. So, for example, I know last lesson we were looking at paramedics that were working on people. So, for example, being a paramedic is difficult because you have to make a lot of quick decisions. So that could be something. So decisions in a very short period of time. So, and then finally too, you might hear about people making, a snap decision. So for example, a snap decision might be a sudden decision. So for example, when I decided to move across the country, it was a snap decision. So one that you did, so one that was made maybe really quickly and suddenly. So maybe it seems even random, maybe. All right. And just a couple really quick maybe verb collocations as well too, because so you'll hear people talk about to take a decision and to make a decision. So for the most part, there's not really a huge difference between these two things. I tend to use make a decision for everyday decisions. So I'm going to say for like Americans, for Canadians, this is the most common choice for everyday decisions. And then we might say take a decision for like really big decisions. So this for bigger, really important decisions. But there's not a huge difference, and you can use either one of these if you'd like. There's not a huge difference. Okay, so let's get on actually and talk about some of the exam. So part 3 of B2 first, C1 advanced, you basically get a sheet of paper, sort of looks kind of like this. It'll have a question in the middle with 5-6 points surrounding it that are connected to it. And you basically have to talk about the question while taking into consideration the little points that are connected to it. So in this, for example, the question is, what might people have to consider when making these decisions? And so we have some decisions here: choosing a university, finding a job, starting a family, getting married, and then also moving to another country. So, you'll get this piece of paper, you and your partner or partners, if there happens to be three of you in the group. You will have 15 seconds to look at this together. So read the information. The examiner will typically say a little spiel. So here, for example, they might say, here are some things people often have to make decisions about, and a question for you to discuss. First, you have some time to look at the task. So you'll get 15 seconds just to look, read the information over. So do that, and you can think of yourself too, maybe a couple points, but read the information carefully so you know what the question is, so you can stay on topic. Really important. And then they'll say, now talk to each other about what people might have to consider when making these decisions. And then basically what you want to do is have a discussion around these points, and then there'll be a follow-up discussion for you both to talk about afterwards for another minute. So just a couple really quick tips, right? Try not to repeat what your partner said, right? We want to be original. We always want to be adding to the conversation, right? Another tip is to try to keep your contributions short, right? So some people might get into this task and they start kind of dominating the conversation with with a long answer. They might start talking for like a minute or two. But it's not a monologue, and actually you're judged on how well you can interact and engage in a conversation on this part. So instead, keep your contributions short, and then ask your partner for their opinion, right? So ask them if they maybe agree with you, disagree with you, what their thoughts. You can ask them what their thoughts are on a point, right? The goal really of this part of the exam, and also part 4, is to have a good conversation and show that you can participate in a conversation, that you can contribute relevant ideas, that you can agree, disagree, state your opinion, that sort of thing. So we're going to be focusing on having a good conversation. And also another thing too, right? Just because I know sometimes people try to focus on thinking about brilliant ideas. Your ideas don't necessarily have to be brilliant. They can be kind of, generic things that everybody might say, right? But you don't have to do that. You just have to make sure that your ideas are on point, they're relevant, that you're contributing to the conversation. The ideas do not have to be mind-blowing, nothing like that, all right? So always remember you're being evaluated on the quality of your English, not the quality of your ideas, right? So, all right. So let's look here. Right. So here's the question again. Bigger. So hopefully you can see it bigger. So again, right. So what might people have to consider when making these decisions? All right. So let's actually just maybe really quickly brainstorm some vocabulary for talking about this question. Vocabulary. Because there's a couple forms that we might talk about here, right? So with consider. Because consider, the verb consider, to consider. So you can consider a thing, like a noun. So for example, when choosing a school program, when maybe considering a school, you'd have to consider the programs. So there we go, we have consider followed directly by a noun. If we're going to follow it by a verb, it's actually going to take the ing form of that verb. So for example, when moving, you'd have to consider selling some of your things, probably. So you can see here, I've put, to sell behind consider, and you can see here that I've taken the ing form of that verb. So whenever we have considered followed by the verb like that, it's got to be the ing form. And we could also use it as a that clause. So for example, to consider that is very common. And here, so after that, it's just going to be like a new clause. So for example, when moving, you need to consider that, I don't know, other countries have different cultures and values, maybe. So here you can say we need to consider that new clause, right? Other countries, subject, verb, rest of the phrase, right? Okay, perfect. All right. We could also say you could take into consideration something. So to take something into consideration. So for example, people would need to take in consideration their financial situations, maybe, when moving, maybe, or we could also say, you'd have to think about, but yeah, so take into consideration, that's a good key. Oops. That's also a good way to talk about this. All right. So let's brainstorm. And again, feel free to throw out some of your ideas. Let's maybe focus on, I don't know, let's focus on choosing a university first. So feel free also to put your ideas in the chat so we can brainstorm some ideas together. We'll put everything into our notes together, and then we'll have some great things to look at afterwards. So, choosing a university. So, maybe for example, right, so one thing you'd have to consider are the academic programs available, right? So for example, someone would want to make sure that the university's programs align with their career interests or goals, for example, right? So if we say that the programs align with something, that those are programs that are going to be useful with what they want to do. Maybe also location, maybe. So maybe, I don't know. Another thing to take into consideration maybe is the location of the university. So for example, students may live in a rural area, but the university may be in a city. So they'd have to see if that, if it's feasible for them to attend. And a feasible is a great word here. It's feasible, as in it like it's possible, doable. Yeah, so they have to see if it's feasible for them to attend, maybe. So that could be something. Maybe also, cost. University can be really expensive, right? And maybe also they'd have to consider financial aid, right? So for example, right, so like I said, well, university can be really expensive. It's important to consider what financial, or maybe what options are available for financial aid. That could be something, right? They might also look into scholarships. So financial aid, that's like just a very general way to refer to not only, potentially scholarships, but it's usually more like grants. So maybe government grants, student loans, that sort of thing. Whereas scholarships, those are typically things that you are awarded, maybe based on your performance. So based on your academic performance, usually. And then that money gets used towards maybe your tuition, typically. Yeah. And scholarships are great because this is money that you actually don't have to pay back, right? So that's different from student loans because, for example, student loans typically, usually you have to pay them back. Whereas scholarships, that's usually free money. So yeah, so that might be something that people would have to take into consideration, right? Because university can be expensive, or maybe you live in a place where university is like a public university, so you don't actually have to pay. Maybe it's paid by the government, right? Which is really fantastic. Um, yeah. So if you have any other ideas, feel free to throw them out in the chat. Um, Another thing people might think about maybe is maybe like student life, maybe the college, like the campus culture. So if we're talking about maybe the culture, like campus culture, so like, things to for students to do basically. And just maybe kind of like the overall feeling or the vibe of a place. So I know vibe is a bit of a funny word here. But that's kind of has to do with, like the atmosphere of a place, right? Some campuses might be seem very, really academic. Maybe the students are very, very serious, right? Um, and the vibe of that place might feel a little bit more stuffy, a little more, um, I don't know, just a little more serious than, for example, uh, a place that is popular for partying, right? For example, because I know so that's a thing too, as well, right? Yeah. Also, the reputation is really important, right? Yeah, exactly. Exactly, right? So, there's a lot of universities are ranked, right? So students may take into consideration the university's reputation and where they rank in comparison to other universities, right? So that's really important as well, right? Um, some universities are more suited for certain programs, right? So that's really important too. And then, you can look too about the success of their graduates afterwards too, right? Like how successful are the graduates in finding jobs in their chosen fields, right? That sort of thing. And what did they do afterwards? So all that is really important as well. Yeah, so great idea. Um, yeah, so some ideas there. Let's talk about another one, maybe. You know, maybe moving to another country. Maybe that's a big thing. And I think that like a lot of people who are taking these kind of exams are thinking about moving abroad, right? So what kind of things do you have to think about when moving to another country? So that's like a huge life decision. Um, maybe employment opportunities. So maybe you'd have to think about employment opportunities, right? You'd also have to think if maybe your qualifications are going to be good in that country, right? Because I know sometimes it's common to maybe earn a certificate in one country, but then maybe it's not recognized in another country. So that can be a problem for people who want to move abroad, right? Um, yeah, exactly. So you'd also maybe have to think if you're, I don't know. Maybe you'd also have to think about cost of living, right? So, some countries, have extremely high costs of living. So you have to think about how you'll afford life in that new place, potentially. So that could be something, right? And if we're talking about costs of living, right? So we talk about costs of living, we're talking about the cost of housing, food, for example, healthcare, just like the general cost of goods, right? So some countries have really high costs of living where you have to pay a lot to be there, whereas others have lower costs of living. So you don't spend as much money for rent, food, those sort of things. So that's a really big thing. Um, Another thing as well. Um, Hello, welcome. um, yeah, feel free to throw in some ideas about what you would have to consider when thinking about moving to another country. We are brainstorming some ideas. Um, you might also think about immigration and maybe visa requirements, right? So, because those processes are really can be very lengthy processes, right? Um, so yeah, so you'd have to think about the visa and immigration requirements, right? Sometimes the processes are really lengthy. Um, there's a lot of paperwork to do, and you have to, meet certain criteria. So if we talk about a lengthy process, that's a process that's going to take a lot of time. So a lot of time to get through. And if we talk about paperwork, we're talking about forms. Basically, forms and official documents you have to fill out. Um, and the criteria is basically, what are those check marks that you have to meet in order to get into a new place? Yeah, language as well. Exactly. Yeah, language is a huge thing as well, right? Language, right? Right? Yeah. So you'd have to think about the language, there might be a language barrier if if you can't speak maybe the local language. So that could be a huge issue as well, right? So for example, maybe you'd have to take some courses to learn how to, speak with the natives. That could be a thing as well, right? Or maybe if you knew the language, you might have to take a few lessons to maybe brush up on your language skills, maybe. So if we brush up on something, we are sort of just refreshing ourselves, our knowledge, right? So we are getting, refreshed with the language and just remembering again what we knew before. Yeah, so we might have to do that, right? Can we think of some other things, maybe, for moving to another country? Although these are all really great ideas, I think. Maybe one more. Maybe, how about family? Because we are talking about people, right? So, topic people. Maybe, like, if your family and the sort of like, maybe the community that's there. So maybe your family or the community in the new country. You know, maybe you have people there already. So one thing you'd have to think about is, who you know in the country. For example, if you knew someone already, maybe you could get I don't know, in touch with them once you arrive. Or maybe they could help you. On the other hand, maybe you don't know, maybe you won't know anyone in a country. So maybe you'd want to look into ways to meet people, right? So I know that sometimes there are sort of online places that you could go, meet and greets, things like that. Or maybe you'd want to enroll yourself in a community activity. Yeah, there's a lot of huge problems that could come up if you don't know the local language, right? Yeah, so that's a huge thing too, right? So, um, yeah, so I think maybe also too, like maybe you would, so maybe before going, you'd maybe inform yourself about where to get help if you need some translations or some help or some assistance because there's a language barrier. Maybe something like that, right? So those could be things that we could think about, right? All right, great. Yeah. So, as I mentioned, right? So this part it's going to be sort of a conversation, right? So a conversation between you and your partner or partners if there happens to be three of you. Um so what are some ways that we can ask for our partner's opinion, right? And so a few obvious ones could be, what do you think about da 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 da? Maybe, what do you think about um I don't know. What do you think about finding a job in a new country, for example? Something like that, or maybe how do you feel about, what I've just said, right? Or what do you feel about this? We could also potentially ask people to agree or disagree. Just lost my Facebook thing. I have too many. I have like a lot of windows open. Um, we could also ask them to agree or disagree. For example, we could maybe, ask them, do you agree with me about this? Um, or we could also, tell them if we agree or disagree with their opinions. So, for example, if we're in agreement, we could say, for example, that's a great point. I agree with you, right? Or maybe, Yeah, that's a great idea. We could say that as well. Um, we could also disagree, right? So maybe, for example, it's like, I don't agree with you at all. Or I can't agree with this. Maybe something like this. I do want to point out really quickly, because sometimes I see people saying this error. They say, I am agree, but we don't say that. So here in English, agree is its own verb, and then if it's negative, it has the don't in front of it or doesn't in front of it. Um, and it's just I agree or he agrees. Like we conjugate it like any normal verb. So so not I am agree, but I agree, or not I not agree, or I don't, or I am not agree. Yeah, we say I don't agree, or I can't agree with this. Um, okay, yeah. All right. So part four, really quickly, right? So part four is going to be a continuation of the topics discussed in part three. So these are more open-ended questions. So for example, they're going to be questions about your opinion. They're also going to be more abstract, sort of big picture topics. So in part one, a lot of those questions are just going to be about you, your personal experiences, your life, that sort of thing. Whereas in part four, these are more bigger things. So maybe about people, about society in general, about concepts in general. So how it works basically is either you or your partner will be asked a question by the examiner, and then you're going to have an opportunity to respond, give your opinion, so whatever you think about that. Um, and then you should take the opportunity and you should ask your partner what they think. Okay, so this final step is actually not a requirement. You do not have to actually do that. If you don't, the examiner will ask them the same question. However, it's always better to be proactive. So if we're proactive, we are taking the initiative. We are just doing it. So go ahead, you can ask them what they think about it. And then the idea in this part as well is to continue the discussion. So it goes on for about 5 minutes. Um, and you should just talk about, the topic. And you will either run out of time or run out of things to say. If you run out of things to say, then the examiner is just going to ask another question, again, related to the topic in part three, and they will help direct the conversation that way. Or you could just simply, take that question, maybe it's a really good one, and you can just talk until the time runs out. So, again, the point here is to have like a really fantastic, a really good conversation, right? Show that you can, talk to your partner, bring up relevant ideas, engage in a conversation, and yeah, just, talk like you would. And again, don't worry about the quality of your ideas, right? We always want to focus on the quality of our English, less about the quality of our ideas. And again, you also don't have to know, everything ever about a topic, right? We're just basically having a conversation like you might with a stranger or a colleague or a friend. So don't overthink it. Try to relax and just have a nice casual conversation with your partners. All right. So let's think about this question then. So, why is why do some people find it difficult to make decisions? So, feel free to throw out an idea if you'd like in the chat. Why some people find it difficult to make decisions. And I'm going to encourage you to answer the question. For example, give a reason. And that if you have time, so depending on how quickly you're able to talk, right? How fluent you are, you may also have time to give, an example. But again, we're not it's not a monologue, right? We don't want to dominate the conversation. But you could give an example just to extend your answer a little bit, and then of course ask your partner what they think, and then you can talk about it. Yeah, so why do some people find it difficult to make decisions? So, let me think. Potentially, well, you know, well, I suppose, like, I think some people might find it difficult because they don't want to make, the wrong decision, right? So here we're back here again, talking about this decision that was not right, right? So, maybe they fear that there could be, I don't know, negative consequences um, due to their choice. So, for example, so a negative consequence, those are going to be negative, sort of bad outcomes, right? That are a result of their choice. Yeah, so maybe it would be hard for that reason, right? Um, maybe they might, they worry they might end up maybe regretting their decision. So if you regret a decision, that means that, like, after you feel that, you've made the wrong choice, and you're kind of mad about yourself about it almost. Yeah. Yeah, so you're kind of disappointed that you took that, and then yeah, so you kind of end up regretting about it. And I used end up here, like, as in, like, so you make this, and then at the end, uh, this is where you end up. This is what you become. So yeah, so they worry they might end up regretting their decision, and here also ing form because it comes after a preposition here. Yeah, so that could be something. Um, Maybe they're also worried that maybe maybe their decision is not going to turn out as expected. So, if we talk about, how things turn out, we mean, like, what happens, right? So, maybe they had one thing in mind, and then in the end, it did something else, right? So maybe they're worried that that's going to happen, and that will make it hard for them to make a decision, right? That's a good point too. Yeah, okay. So we have, yeah, so maybe it's because people are not used to making any decisions. So they don't feel comfortable taking on the responsibility of the consequences. Yeah, so that's a good point, right? So some people, yeah, don't get a lot of chance to make their own decisions at all, right? So maybe that's hard, right? Maybe they doubt themselves. Like you said, they doubt their ability to deal with negative consequences, right? They're worried about being the person responsible for that. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so it could be really hard that way, right? Um, I was thinking too, maybe people, like, some people have a tendency to overthink things and analyze every detail about something. So in those situations, it can be really hard to come to a decision since you're always, evaluating and thinking about the pros and cons. It's never ending, right? So that could be something. Yeah, if you overthink something, you think it too much. And if you analyze, details, you're thinking about every single thing, probably too much. Yeah, and if you have a tendency to do this, you have a habit of doing that, right? Yeah, so I think that's pretty common. Um, yeah, absolutely. So really challenging. Maybe they also, maybe some people also become overwhelmed with information, right? Maybe some people just get overwhelmed by information. So, if you're an overthinker, it's really easy to just have too many options in front of you, and then if you feel overwhelmed, it's like there's so much and you can't really deal with it. So you feel overwhelmed when you have too much to deal with, and it just, it's hard to cope with, right? So it's a bad feeling. Um, Potentially also, maybe maybe this is could also be. We talked a bit earlier about, them maybe regretting their decision. Maybe it's not going to turn out as expected. Maybe they're uncomfortable taking on, the responsibility of what happens, right? Maybe they just have anxiety as well, right? So, some people may really like suffer a lot of anxiety when making decisions. And of course, so anxiety, that's going to be a fear basically about the future, right? So if you have anxiety, you have a fear about the future, right? Um, so some people may suffer a lot of anxiety when making decisions because they are really afraid about the future and what might happen. Yeah, so that could be something. Um, or maybe they have trouble, or maybe they have trouble prioritizing their preferences or their needs. And of course, so if we prioritize something, we are basically weighing them from, most important thing, second most important thing, third, fourth. So we're basically listing them in order of importance. So list something in order of importance. Yeah, so that could be like a huge thing, right? Yeah. So, lots of great ideas about why some people might find it difficult to make decisions. And of course, too, you could always bring up maybe your own, like an example from your own life as well, right? Because we all have difficult decisions that we have to make from time to time, right? So, you could also bring up those things as well. Um, Here's another great question as well. Do you think people ought to get advice before making big decisions? That people ought, oops, ought to get advice. Ugh, ought to get advice before making big decisions. So here, this ought to, right? That's going to be like should, right? So do you think people should get advice? So just another way, that's like basically the phrasal model to say should. So do you think they should get advice? Ought to get advice before making big decisions? Um, what do you guys think? So we can kind of go like a couple different ways, right? Let's talk about the yeses first. So yes, they absolutely should. So yes, I think it's always a good idea to get advice from others before making a decision. And actually, a really quick point. Um, so here, advice, I just want to point out that advice is always uncountable. So advice, always uncountable. We never say advices. Ugh. So we never say advices. We never want to say advices. It's always going to be uncountable. We could say a piece of advice. So for example, yeah, could you give me a piece of advice? That would be okay. But we tend to say some advice, for example, or just advice as uncountable. So I need some advice, or yeah, here we can see that it's just get advice. Yeah, so always uncountable. All right. So yes, they absolutely should. So why do we think it's a good idea that they get advice? So maybe yes, it's a good idea to get advice because maybe having other people's opinions and feedback maybe will help them make more informed decisions or informed choices, right? So we talked earlier, an informed decision, that's a decision based on having lots of information, lots of knowledge, right? So an informed decision. We could also maybe help them identify potential pitfalls, maybe, consulting. It's a good idea because consulting with someone um, who has more experience or knowledge can help identify problems or potential pitfalls. So pitfalls is kind of an interesting word, kind of a fancy word here. A pitfall is kind of like a hidden problem. It's usually a problem that happens because of something, but you didn't really think it was going to be a problem beforehand. So a hidden problem that maybe you didn't consider before doing something. So it's always important to look out for hidden problems or pitfalls, things that might come up as a result of your decision. So consulting other people can help you do that, right? Also, another really quick thing that I want to point out. So here, remember, so because is again another preposition. So if we're going to have a verb after it, it's going to have that ing form. So because having other people's opinions and feedback is important, or because consulting is a good idea. So always because ing form. Let's see here. Yeah, so getting advice. Advice is essential. So really important because we can make a better decision by considering different points of view. Exactly. Yeah, so that's a great idea as well. So if it's essential, really important. And again here as well, right? So by preposition, ing form, exactly. So great. So we can make a better decision by considering different points of view. And of course, different points of view, those are like what other people think, right? Yeah, so that's a really good idea. Yeah. Yeah, they could maybe, like you said, consider other points of view. It's good. I'll say, yeah, I agree. It's always good to consider other perspectives when thinking about uh, a problem, like a big decision. Yeah, so again, perspectives. That's another way too that we can talk about, different points of view. So really good idea. And there you see, I agreed with you. I agree. That's a great point. Good idea. Um, yeah. On the other hand, what do you, maybe let's think about the no side. So no, it's never a good idea. um, for me, maybe personally, I'd rather rely on my own, judgment when making a big decision. Um, so I'd rather rely, so depend on my own judgment, so my own ability to make decisions or what I think, right, when making a big decision. So that could be on the no side, right? I mean, sometimes, uh, seeking advice can lead to maybe conflicting opinions, and it can make decision making even more difficult, right? So we're talking about conflicting opinions. Conflicting opinions, those are opinions that um, they sort of counter one another. They go against one another, so they're not in agreement with one another. So that can make it really hard, right? So if you have like a big decision, so that could definitely happen. Um, you know, we also too, right? It's important. So maybe, you know, it's important to maybe trust your own instincts when making an important decision, right? So if we're trusting our own instincts, that means we are trusting our intuition, our gut feeling, so what we feel about a situation instead of what other people tell us. Um, so trust what we feel about something without influence from others, right? So we put that ahead. We gotta trust what we think. Yeah. So those are great ideas. And I think the third option, right? So like so we talked about yes, it's a good idea. Maybe no, it's not a good idea. Maybe we could say it depends. It depends on the situation. And again, it depends with an S. Sometimes people drop that, but we do want to get in the habit of saying it depends, always with an S. So it depends on the situation. And also, yeah, also the preposition is always on, but I've noticed most people dropping the S's when they say it depends. Yeah, always depends on the situation. So it depends. Maybe it's not necessary when the decision is related to personal values, maybe, or personal preferences, right? So things that are important to us, right? Um, so that could be something. Um, but it's hard to say. I don't know. And feel free to add some ideas as well, too, right? You could think of a couple other things to say about this. Um, maybe too, right? Some decisions are so important and will have a significant impact on our lives. So, in those situations, it's important to seek advice from trusted sources or from trusted people. Yeah, so some decisions are so important and will have a significant impact on our lives. So in those situations, it's important to seek advice. So here, seek advice. This is a great collocation. So we seek advice. It basically means we go and I want to say find advice, but we're going out of our way to get advice from other people. So we go and find advice from other people. So we source out that information so we can inform ourselves, figure out what we want to do. All right. And one last question for us to think about, and then we'll wrap up. um, what do you think about people who change their minds after making decisions? So if you change your mind, to change your mind about something, it means that you decide one thing, but then afterwards you maybe go back on it, maybe reverse the idea. Maybe you decide something completely different. Yeah, so what do you think about people who change their minds about things? Because some people really waffle. Oh, there's a word. So if you waffle, to waffle on something, it means that you go back and forth. You don't really come to like a concrete decision. So, yeah, so you're really unsure about what to do. And this is a very informal, a very slang way to talk about something. Quit waffling and make a decision. And if you don't know, an actual waffle is actually usually it's kind of similar to a pancake, but it's something that you might eat for breakfast. But here we're using it to talk about being indecisive. So that's kind of a funny word. Yeah. So what do we think about people who make decisions? Well, I guess on one hand, it's normal for people to change their minds when making decisions. So, for example, um, maybe you make a decision and then find out some new information. So, for example, maybe you make a decision and then you find out some new information. Well, in that situation, then you might want to change your mind, right? So it's natural, to adjust our decision based on new information, right? Or yeah, or what comes up. So if we adjust our decision, that means that we're modifying it, right? So we're going to adjust our decision based on, so according to new information or what comes up, so things that happened, right? So that could be something. Um, yeah, okay, so that's a good idea. Yeah, right. So we have here, um, you know, so what do you think about? Well, maybe they probably didn't get good advice, or maybe they made a hasty decision, or made hasty decisions. Exactly. Yeah, right. So again, right, going back to a hasty decision, that's a decision that you make, you don't think about a lot, usually because you don't have a lot of time, right? Maybe you're under a lot of stress. So you have to make a decision quickly, and then maybe it's not a good decision. So yeah, absolutely. So yeah, so in that situation, you can't fault someone for changing their mind. So as an example, like you can't blame someone. So we can't blame them because it makes sense, right? Of course you'd change your mind, maybe, if it was a hasty decision and then you ended up regretting it. Um, yeah, maybe sometimes it depends on the circumstances. So circumstances, really fancy way to say situation, right? So maybe it depends on the circumstances. You know, however, I don't know, changing one's mind frequently can be a sign of indecisiveness or a lack of commitment to something. So here's two sort of like things to think about. If we're indecisive, that means that we have a really hard time choosing what we want to do. So if you're, and of course, indecisiveness, that's like the quality of being indecisive. So, indecisiveness, the quality of being indecisive. And if you're this, you have a really, really hard time coming to a decision. Yeah, so big deal. So yeah, so maybe it's a sign of indecisiveness, right? So you don't really know. Or a lack of commitment to something. So, like, you're not committed enough, right? Right? So if we talk about lack of commitment, it means that you're not into it. So maybe that's a sign. Um, I don't know. I definitely think that it's human nature to change your ideas, change your mind about things. Um, yeah. If anybody else has any ideas, feel free to throw them out there. Um, I think in general, so maybe while it can be annoying, because it can be annoying when people waffle or when the people are indecisive, right? So while it can be annoying, I think for the most part, it's a good quality. It's important to reconsider our decisions when we are presented with new evidence or new information. So, if we say something is good for the most part, we mean that there's more positives than there are negatives, right? So I think for the most part, it's a good quality. It's mostly good. It's important to reconsider our decisions. So if we reconsider a decision, or if we reconsider something, we think about it again. Yeah, so it's important to reconsider our decisions when we are presented with, so when we are given new maybe evidence, so when we see maybe new proof of things or new ideas, new information, or new information. Yeah. Yeah, so that's a good that's a good point. Yeah. Yeah, so indecisive people probably are not very reliable. So maybe so I'm, doubtful or skeptical about people who change their minds after making a decision. People who are indecisive tend to not be reliable. Yeah, exactly. So if you're reliable, people can depend on you, right? So here's the opposite. Like you can't rely on this person because they'll probably change their mind. Maybe they said that they wanted to go to a movie and then they decide last minute that they're not interested. It's really hard to make plans with somebody if they're going to do that, right? Exactly. All right. So lots of great words today. Lots of great collocations. Interesting topic, right? It's always important to make decisions, and obviously it's something that we all do. We all have to do from time to time. Um, As usual, I will go ahead and I will update all of these notes, and I will add them to the Discord. I will also add this video to YouTube, so you could go check it out there as well. I'd like to thank everybody who contributed to the chat. That was really fantastic. As always, if you want more opportunities to get speaking English with me, I have a bunch of things happening on Telegram. So we have groups for C1 Advanced, B2 first, and also just students around that level as well. There's also a place where you can get daily speaking prompts. So just on the main channel here, so Instagram, Telegram, Facebook as well. Share a prompt every day. So you can go check that out there and get speaking there as well. I also have a bunch of community things happening so next month. So I've decided I'm going to try to do one live stream each week for an hour. So we're going to look at part 1 on May 10th, part 2 May 17th, part 3 May 24th. These are all Wednesdays, I should say, at 1400 UTC. And we're actually going to be talking about, I didn't put it on here, but the topic is going to be education. So I am talking about education next month in all the things that I am planning. And we also have a weekly free reading class where we all get together, we check out an article, we talk about some of the vocabulary, and then we have a bit of a discussion around the topics that come up during while we're reading. So everybody's welcome to come out for that as well. The free ones alternate between easier and harder articles. So May 6th, that's going to be an easier one. May 13th, a harder one, etc., etc. So those are on Saturdays at 1600 UTC time as well. And you have to register for these on a place called Calendly, and you will get a link to join them. And also if you happen to be in the groups, so if you happen to be in the groups for B2 first and C1 Advanced, in the closed groups, I just share a link there. And if you want information about how to join those groups, you could just send me a message and I can let you know how to get involved with that. And of course, I'm also available for lessons and things like that. But in the future too, I'm hoping to do more group lessons, so feel free to stay tuned for that. All right, so again, this is Axel, Get Speaking English. Again, thank you so much for coming out today, and I can't wait to get speaking English with you super soon. Okay, fantastic. All right, bye everybody.